Hi everyone, it's Katrina. Number 10. The Vimana. The Vimana is a powerful flying machine described in Sanskrit texts from ancient India. We can find mention of the Vimana in all kinds of these ancient writings, from the Ramayana to the Yajurveda. It's almost always described as the same thing. It was an enormous temple or a palace which could fly through the sky like a floating city. Not only could the Vimana travel through the atmosphere, but they could also fly to space and dive underwater. Imagine the biggest temple you can think of, but it can launch itself into space to visit other planets. Weirdly enough, legends of the Vimana gave specific details about how the mysterious thing achieved its flight. It was described as having at least 2 engines, although no one can explain how the ancients even knew what an engine was. The flying fortress was also said to have deadly weapons, things that could wipe out entire civilizations. They could be used for ordinary travel to get from one place to another, or for warfare. Scientifically, there is no evidence that the Vimana was real. Archaeologists have never found any proof that flying machines soared above the skies of India, but that doesn't mean one didn't exist. Judging by how many stories of flying machines there are in ancient Indian texts, the idea came from somewhere, maybe somebody or something, which was mistaken for a god by the original inhabitants of India, visited using an advanced spaceship. But because the locals understood nothing about space travel, they just described it as a flying temple. What do you think? Just ancient mythology or something else? Let me know in the comments below. Number 9. The stone monuments of Nuku Hiva. The stone monuments of Nuku Hiva are quite strange. For those unfamiliar with this place, Nuku Hiva is a large French Polynesian island in the Pacific Ocean. It's famous for the stone monuments scattered across its beautiful and isolated landscape. Most of the stone monuments are at a small settlement called Temehea Tohua. Archaeologists say they were created between the 11th and 14th centuries, and that every statue is a depiction of one of the ancient deities of Nuku Hiva. And although these deities are ancient, some are still being worshipped today. What we know is that the original inhabitants of this tropical island arrived several thousand years ago, and although their culture has changed since then, their origin story has remained more or less the same. According to the people of Nuku Hiva, the god of creation is Ono. He created the Polynesian islands as a gift to his wife, taking the earth and turning it into a giant palace. But that palace eventually decayed, and the islands are what remains of its walls and roof. Another interesting thing about these people is that there were once way too many of them. The island itself had about 100,000 people. This made it almost impossible for communities to live and eat. They had food shortages, there weren't enough fish, and supposedly the people of the island resorted to organized cannibalism. Under the trees of Nuku Hiva and beyond, the tropical coastline has a secret history of blood and death. Number 8. The Roman financial crisis. When most of us think about ancient Rome, we think of wealth, powerful armies, and an undying legacy. But there is a less talked about, more forbidden part of Roman history that may just be a warning for our own grim future. Historian Charles Bartlett recently compared something that happened in Rome 2,000 years ago to the economic crisis of 2008. In the year 33 AD, the Roman Empire plunged into economic chaos. This happened when rulers passed a law that required creditors to invest part of their capital in Italian lands. The money was used to help with agriculture, create more beautiful pieces of architecture, and solidify the foundation of Rome. Everyone was supposed to be a winner. But what happened is that creditors rushed to buy as much land as they could. It created a credit crunch. The Roman Emperor Tiberius had to free up vast sums of money for interest-free loans to stop the crisis from getting any worse. In simple terms, land became suddenly valuable in Italy. Those with the credit to purchase the land did it as quickly as they could. But to do it, they had to call in all their debts. Debtors then went broke. They purchased too much land and prices dropped. There was a desperate buy and sell spree, credit was non-existent, and the land value plummeted as interest rates were driven up sharply. It was a mess, almost like what happened in 2008. What many people don't realize is that the same thing that happened in the modern world already happened in the Roman world. And we all know how that ended. Number 7. The Prophet Daniel. The prophecy of Daniel is a book in the Old Testament, and like anything having to do with the Bible, there is a great divide between what archaeologists say and what the religious believers say. But what happens when that line is blurred? To give you an example, scholars didn't think King David was a real person until 1993, when they discovered artifacts in Jerusalem proving beyond a doubt that King David lived and breathed. Theologians did not believe that Belshazzar was an actual figure, but just a character in the Bible. Daniel, in chapters 5, 7, and 8, mentions Belshazzar 8 times, and in the year 1854, archaeologists discovered 4 ancient cuneiform cylinders in Ur, the greatest city of Old Babylonia. These cylinders mentioned Belshazzar, son of King Nabonidus. No matter which side you're on, science or faith, archaeological evidence shows much of what was written in the prophecy of Daniel is non-fiction. Look at King Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, between 605 BC and 562 BC. The Bible says he was driven away from men and ate grass like an ox, while his hair grew like feathers and his nails became birds' claws. Historians believe this part of the Bible can be explained by a weird psychological disease called boanthropy. It's when a person goes completely insane and acts like a cow, walking on all fours in a field and eating grass. It's a strange mental disorder allegedly brought on by dreams or hypnotism. Number 6. The Knights Templar. On Christmas 1119, Baldwin II, King of Jerusalem, persuaded a group of French knights to protect pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land. This was the formation of the Order of the Knights Templar. These knights lived like monks, took vows of chastity and poverty, and would protect peasants and civilians against enemies using violence. At least this was how they started. But just shy of 200 years later, in 1314, the Crusades were over. The Church abolished the Templars, and they burned the Grand Master of the Order at the stake in Paris. It was a miserable and fiery end for what is one of the most mysterious orders that ever existed. One thing you might not know is the connection between the Freemasons and the Knights Templar. Spoiler alert, there isn't one. Frank Sanello, a professional historian, explained in 2003 that Andrew Ramsey, a senior French Freemason of the 18th century, made up the link between the Freemasons and the Crusaders. He was the first one to claim that the Freemasons had descended from the order. It was all a trick to appeal to the French aristocracy to get more members. What's your favorite conspiracy theory involving the Knights Templar? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. Number 5. The Hill of Torture. On a hilltop in Auriesville, New York, is the Hill of Torture. On this hill is something that most Americans have probably never heard of. There is a shrine dedicated to 3 American martyrs of the 17th century. They are a trio who shed their blood for Christ right on this very spot in the 1640s. They were actually missionaries trying to convert the Native Americans, who weren't really interested, and you can probably understand why. Invading their land, bringing disease, and insulting their religion. You get it. But these 3 died pretty awful deaths. These 3 martyrs had been trying to spread the word of Jesus to the New World. Father Isaac Jogues died from being hit in the head with a tomahawk. Ren Goupil and John Lalande had their fingernails ripped out and their teeth pulled one by one. Their torture was so heinous that the men went down in history as martyrs and were given their own holy hill in New York. Number 4. The Sinaia lead plates. The Sinaia lead plates are fake nonsense, or are some of the most priceless artifacts in the world. Experts can't quite figure it out. The lead plates were supposedly cast from the solid gold originals, with the inscriptions of an unknown language, a language made with the Greek alphabet and a few random unknown characters. They were discovered in a warehouse at the Bucharest Museum of Antiquities in Romania back in the 1800s. There were 200 pieces in the collection, and nobody has any idea where they came from. They just showed up there. Photos were taken proving that there were indeed 200 pieces, but only 35 are left today. When they were first found, professionals at the museum disregarded the plates as forgeries. They looked too new. They couldn't find any traces of erosion on the plates, and the gold originals were nowhere to be found. Still, these treasures were valuable enough to be removed in 1916 when World War I broke out. It wasn't until 2003 that interest was renewed in the mysterious artifacts. Some said the original gold copies had been kept at the Sinaia Monastery in Romania, then used to build Pele's castle. Nobody has ever deciphered the language on the plates. Plus, an analysis by the Institute of Atomic Physics concluded they were probably made from lead in the 19th century. And so, the mystery of the plates continues. Number 3. The Treasure of the Llanganatis. The Treasure of the Llanganatis is another bizarre trove of artifacts that may or may not be real. This treasure comprises massive amounts of gold, silver, and electrum, relics that are supposedly hidden deep in Ecuador in the Llanganatis mountain range. The Incan general Ruminahui put them there in the 16th century. To understand this better, we need to start at 1532 with Francisco Pizarro. He established the town of San Miguel de Piura and began his glorious conquest of the Inca Empire. He captured King Atahualpa at Cajamarca, and the king offered to give him vast amounts of gold for his life and freedom. Naturally, Francisco agreed. Things went wrong quickly. The Spaniard didn't trust the Inca king, and he had him killed in July 1533. But according to legend, his general, Ruminahui, had been on his way there with the gold for the ransom at the time of the king's death. When he learned of the treachery, he changed his course and hauled the treasure deep into the mountains. It's allegedly still there, somewhere hiding in a cave or at the bottom of a lake. Number 2. The Meowing Nuns. There is a bizarre story about a case of mass hysteria which possessed a secluded convent of nuns in France during the Middle Ages. We don't have an exact year, but the nuns were apparently overcome with the desire to meow like cats. These nuns slowly went insane, meowing for hours at a time, and would only stop when soldiers beat and whipped them. Shortly after this original case, the same thing happened in Germany in the 15th century. This time, a group of nuns bit each other. News traveled through the region, and other nuns at other nunneries had the same problem. It was a biting epidemic, and it spread as far as Holland and Rome. This is a real thing that happened based on historical records all across Europe, and yet nobody knows why it happened. Reports from the 15th century say the nuns would continue to bite each other until they were exhausted. They meowed like cats, bit strangers, and it was all around very weird. It only stopped when religious leaders turned to the civil authorities to have the nuns flogged, dunked in barrels of water, and thrown in prison. Order was eventually restored, and there have been very few outbreaks of biting mania ever since. Number 1. The Church of the Holy Sepulcher. In Jerusalem, there are thousands of tiny medieval crosses carved into the walls of the holiest church in the world. It's the Church of the Holy Sepulcher, the sacred site allegedly built on the place where the Romans crucified Jesus. Religious scholars have chalked up the crosses to graffiti left behind by medieval pilgrims. A recent study of the crosses shows they were masons. Researcher Amit Rehem analyzed every inch of each cross on the wall. He looked at the depth, the width, and the hand of the people who carved them. What he discovered is that the crosses were likely all carved by the same person, or by just one or two people. Why did they do this? The best guess archaeologists have is that pilgrims from all over Europe journeyed to the church and then paid a stonemason to carve a cross for them on the wall. They saved the dust created by the carving as a sacred keepsake. Pilgrims probably put the dust in a small lead flask, then took it home as their own piece of the Holy Land. And while the case of the crosses is mysterious, the church itself is the big mystery here. We know the Church of the Holy Sepulcher was built in the 4th century. According to legend, it was the mother of the great Roman Emperor Constantine, Saint Helena, who traveled to Jerusalem and discovered the exact spot where Jesus had been crucified, buried, and subsequently resurrected. Constantine then had the basilica built, which became the Church of the Holy Sepulcher. In modern times, no proof has ever been discovered that this was the place where Jesus Christ came back to life. Thanks for watching. What other forbidden history would you like to learn about? Let me know in the comments below, and remember to subscribe if you haven't already. See you next time. Bye!